He hadn't planned on coming home that night. There was no flight booked, no chauffeur scheduled, no speech rehearsed, just a last-minute decision to skip the Seattle keynote and board a red-eye because something, deep in the gut, unexplainable, told him he needed to go home. Kellen Rourke stepped through the doors of his hilltop house like a stranger returning from war. 12 years of standing ovations, ringing investor calls and awards, etched in crystal, hadn't prepared him for this kind of silence. The air felt thick, not tense, just still. He found her on the balcony, wrapped in a shawl she never wore unless she needed comfort. Her back was to him, her breathing steady. When she finally turned, he froze. Her eyes were swollen, lips trembling. Yet she didn't look broken. She looked brave. "I didn't want to tell you until I was sure," she whispered. He stepped closer, heart pounding against the weight of forgotten hopes. "What is it?" he asked, barely able to swallow the question. She looked him in the eye, her voice fragile but certain. "I'm pregnant. If you believe love deserves second chances, tap that like button, subscribe, and share this story with someone who needs a little hope today." How did two people who once promised forever end up speaking like guests in their own home? For years, that's what their conversations had become. Safe, short, rehearsed. Polite, like business partners. Formal, like diplomats walking on glass. The kind of silence that doesn't scream, it sighs. There was a time Kellen couldn't fall asleep without Maribel's laughter echoing in his mind. Now, months could pass without hearing it once. And yet, they never left. Not physically. They stayed, because walking away would have been easier than admitting they were drifting. Have you ever looked across the table at someone you love and realized you don't know what they're thinking anymore? He had everything. A private jet, a Forbes cover, the respect of an industry. But at night, he stared at the ceiling beside a woman who used to hum, in her sleep, and now barely breathed loud enough for him to notice. He built an empire, but somehow let the foundation of his marriage crack, and on the very night he came home, ready to ask for one more chance, she gave him something he didn't know he was still allowed to hope for. He held her face with both hands as if anchoring himself to reality. Pregnant. The word echoed like a fragile prayer in his mind. It didn't feel real. Not after all the empty sonograms. Not after the quiet goodbyes they never had the strength to say. They had stopped dreaming years ago, not because they wanted to, but because dreaming had started to hurt. Now here they were, two people, stitched together by scars, holding a moment so delicate it felt like it could vanish if they exhaled too hard. "I didn't know how to tell you," she said. "I was scared." "So am I," he replied. "But I want this." They stood in silence, forehead to forehead, not saying a word. They didn't need to. Something long asleep had stirred. If you've ever reached a point where you thought it was too late, too much had been said, too much had been lost, this story is for you. Because sometimes what feels like the end is the exact moment life begins again. Stay with me. Before the boardrooms and balance sheets, before the magazine features and private equity meetings, there was a boy with scraped knees and a girl who rode barefoot on a banana seat bicycle. Kellen Rourke grew up on Maple Hollow Road, where screen doors slammed all summer and porch lights came on just after dinner. Life moved slower there, not by force, but by choice. The kind of town where the corner store clerk knew your birthday and the mayor still fixed his own fence. Maribel Lane lived 2 houses down. Her family had a golden retriever named Tucker who barked at lawnmowers and loved peanut butter crackers. She had a way of sitting, cross-legged on the curb, chin resting on her palms, that made the world feel calm even when nothing else was. They were never officially introduced. One day he handed her a Gatorade after soccer practice. She said thanks, took a sip, and passed it back without flinching. That was the start. They grew up like that, together, without labels. Some kids had summer camps and long vacations. Kellen and Maribel had bike rides down back roads, afternoons catching fireflies and quiet. Talks by the lake when the sun dipped low and the air smelled like warm grass and pine. She wasn't loud, but she was present. Always. He didn't know it then, but some of the best parts of him were built in those moments. Sitting beside her on a log, knees muddy, talking about the future like they had all the time in the world. By middle school, teachers began pairing them for projects before they even asked. "You two work well together," Mr. Haskins once said, handing them a model bridge assignment. They finished it in 2 nights, added LED lights from a junk drawer, and walked into class like engineers. It wasn't just that they were smart, it was that together, they focused. Kellen learned early that Maribel didn't need attention to feel seen. She valued follow-through over flash. She didn't chase compliments, and she rarely gave them, but when she did, you felt it in your chest. They shared everything, even silence. Some days they talked for hours. Other days they just sat near each other, doing nothing, saying nothing, and it never felt awkward. In high school, the shift was gradual. He started walking her home. She started saving him a seat on the bus. Their fingers touched when reaching for the same pencil, and neither of them moved away. The night of their first kiss, they were lying on a trampoline in her backyard, staring up at the sky. He had just told her he wanted to build things that changed the world. She had smiled, turned her face toward his, and said, "Start by being someone who shows up." Then she kissed him, gently, without build-up or warning. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. It was real. They were 17 when Kellen asked her to move to Austin with him. It wasn't a proposal. Not yet. It was a quiet conversation in the back of his pickup, parked by the river where the water lapped against flat stones and memories collected like driftwood. He had gotten into a state university, engineering program, partial scholarship. She had been accepted to a local teaching college but hadn't made a decision. He looked at her like the idea of going without her didn't compute. "We don't have to rush anything," he said, thumb brushing the inside of her palm. "But I know where I'm going, and it doesn't make sense if you're not with me." She stared at the windshield for a long time, then nodded once. They packed everything they owned into 2 suitcases and a dented hatchback. Their parents cried, of course, but they understood. Some things aren't just young love. Some things have roots that start growing long before anyone notices. They moved into a tiny apartment above a deli. The walls were thin. The hot water was inconsistent, but they were building something, even if all they had, at first, was drive and stubbornness. He worked nights delivering takeout while attending classes during the day. She found a job shelving books at the campus library. They'd meet in the early hours, sometimes too tired to talk, but always finding each other under the same scratchy blanket. Dinner was cheap noodles and laughter. Fights came, but they never lasted. Not because they were perfect, far from it, but because they chose to listen. Even when it was hard, especially then. The proposal came one night when the power went out during a storm. Kellen lit 2 candles, placed one on the windowsill and one on the floor between them. He reached into his hoodie pocket and pulled out a ring that barely caught the light. "I don't have much," he said, "but everything I've got, I want to build with you." She didn't cry. She didn't need to. "Yes," was all she said. They got married at the courthouse in jeans and borrowed shoes. Her bouquet was a handful of daisies from the gas station down the block. There was no aisle, no music, no crowd, just them. And still, it felt complete. Their honeymoon was a weekend off work, spent on a borrowed mattress in the middle of their living room, eating cold pizza and writing each other letters they never intended to show anyone. They didn't need extravagance. They had intention, alignment, a shared sense that what they were building mattered, not because it was grand, but because it was theirs. Kellen once told her, "On a walk home in the rain, if I ever forget who I am, remind me that I was once a boy lucky enough to walk beside you." She squeezed his hand in reply. No words, just that, and that was enough. Because back then, love didn't need saving. It just needed showing up. The idea came to Kellen during a late-night walk back from a hardware store. He was 22, overworked, and barely making rent, but his mind never stayed still. He'd been scribbling rough schematics on napkins, takeout boxes, anything with space. Not for recognition, not yet. It was about solving a problem he couldn't stop seeing. Energy systems that wasted more than they produced, and small towns that paid the price. Maribel listened, always. She sat cross-legged on their apartment floor, poring over whiteboard, markers, and loose diagrams with a pencil tucked behind her ear. She wasn't a coder or an engineer, but she had a gift for clarity. "That's too complicated," she'd say gently, pointing at a sketch. "If you can't explain it to a high school science class, you're not done designing." He didn't argue with her. He revised. Racetech started in the back room of a used printer shop. Kellen built his first working prototype using parts bought secondhand, from an online forum and wiring salvaged from old microwaves. The machine didn't look like much, more junk than genius. But when it worked, when the meter moved and The current held. He felt a surge of purpose so strong it made him sit down and catch his breath. He wanted to show her immediately. She was asleep on the couch when he walked in, apron still dusted with flour from her part-time job at the cafe. He knelt beside her, held her hand, and whispered, "It works." Her eyes opened slowly. She didn't need details. She smiled, tucked her head into his shoulder, and whispered back, "Then we're going to be okay." That first year was survival. They rationed groceries, split one meal between two plates, and ran a fan instead of turning on the AC in the Texas heat. Their apartment was cluttered with cables, pizza boxes, and small triumphs written in dry erase marker on every surface. But even in the mess, they had rhythm. On Friday nights, they played music and slow danced barefoot on the tile floor. On Sundays, they took walks with no destination. And in between, there were long nights filled with code crashes, missed calls, and small apologies after exhausted arguments. They built everything side by side, moment by moment, inch by inch. And underneath all the ambition, there was one steady truth. She believed in him more than he sometimes believed in himself. Rice Tech didn't explode overnight. It clawed its way into relevance. Kellen pitched his first investor inside a diner booth, using his phone to demo the energy model on a glitchy interface. The man wore a wedding ring and a poker face. He listened without expression, sipped his black coffee, and said 4 words that made Kellen's chest tighten. "Show me it works." That night, Kellen stayed awake until 4 a.m., refining every detail. He didn't notice Maribel standing in the doorway, watching him. She didn't interrupt, just set a cup of water beside him, touched his shoulder once, and went back to bed. Months passed. 1 pilot program turned into 3, then 5. They hired a second engineer, then 2 more. Their tiny apartment morphed into a storage closet of parts and wires. Kellen took meetings from the kitchen. Maribel gave up her library shifts to manage invoices, calls, logistics, all unpaid, all unnoticed by anyone except him. She never complained, not even once, but she stopped humming when she cooked. Kellen promised they'd take a break after the next demo, after the next deal, after the next install. Soon, he'd say, "Just hang on." And she would nod, offering him a tired smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. They stopped going on their Sunday walks. They started falling asleep at different hours, meals gone cold on the counter. The intimacy didn't disappear, it just went quiet, replaced by goals, targets, milestones. He told himself it was temporary, that building a legacy meant sacrifice, that she understood. But there were nights he looked at her, curled up on the couch, phone cradled in her hands, and felt an ache he couldn't name. One night, after landing their first major corporate client, Kellen came home buzzing with adrenaline. He walked through the door, ready to tell her everything. How the CFO had shaken his hand, how the VP of strategy had called him visionary. But she wasn't on the couch, or in the kitchen. He found her sitting on the bathroom floor, knees to her chest. No tears, no breakdown, just stillness. She looked up at him. "I'm tired, Kel." 3 words, heavy enough to knock the wind out of him. He sat beside her, but didn't speak. He didn't know how, because the truth was, so was he. They had wanted to build something meaningful, and they were, but they hadn't realized that building everything could cost you the very person you started with. The first time, it happened fast. Maribel had been radiant for weeks, hands resting lightly over her abdomen, already speaking in quiet hopes about tiny shoes and lullabies. Kellen had bought a blank journal, intending to fill it with letters for the child they hadn't met yet. They had started choosing names. They argued over music for the nursery before they even bought a crib. And then, nothing. No heartbeat. The room went quiet in a way neither of them had known before. The doctor was kind but clinical. The words felt distant, like they were being spoken underwater. Kellen held Maribel's hand as she stared at the ceiling, not blinking. He didn't cry at first, not until later that night when she finally fell asleep, curled on the edge of the bed, and he stood in the kitchen with his hands flat against the counter, his chest rising too fast. He threw the journal away the next morning quietly, while she was still asleep. He told himself he was protecting her, sparing her the reminder. But the truth was, he couldn't bear to look at it either. They didn't talk about it much. At first, silence felt like respect. But silence doesn't soften pain. It buries it. She stopped saying the baby's name out loud. He stopped asking if she was okay. They returned to routine. Work, errands, small talk. On the outside, they looked steady. But something beneath them had shifted, subtle but real, the kind of shift you feel before the floor gives out. The second pregnancy brought more caution than celebration. They didn't tell anyone. No journal this time. No Pinterest boards. Maribel wouldn't let Kellen hang the tiny socks she'd bought last year. "I just want to wait," she said, forcing a smile. But even in her restraint, there was a flicker of hope. Her body was changing. The tests came back normal. Her cheeks had color again. She started reading quietly in the afternoons, books about parenthood she wouldn't acknowledge until she saw him glance her way. They made it to 10 weeks. At the appointment, the technician frowned slightly, excused herself, and returned with the doctor. Kellen gripped the edge of the chair so tightly his knuckles turned white. Maribel didn't look at him. She didn't move at all. This time, there was no disbelief, just a hollow stillness, as if her body already knew what her heart didn't want to accept. Back home, she went straight to bed. Kellen sat in the living room for hours, phone in hand, unread work emails piling up, calendar notifications blinking. He couldn't remember what day it was. The only sound in the room was the humming of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the old floorboards. He thought about calling his mother, thought about writing down how he felt, but mostly he just stared at the dark window and listened for a sound he couldn't name. In the following days, Maribel barely spoke. She moved through the house like someone who had forgotten what their body was for. She folded laundry that wasn't dirty, rearranged pantry items by color, cleaned the same countertop twice in an hour. Kellen offered to cook, to clean, to hold her. She nodded, thanked him. But her eyes stayed far away. He returned to work faster this time, told himself he needed to stay busy. Ricetech was picking up traction, and if he stopped moving, things might fall apart. In truth, he didn't know how to help her, and it tore at him. At night, they shared the same bed, but not the same space. When she finally cried, it was in the shower. He heard her through the closed door. He wanted to open it, to step in, to pull her into his arms and say something that would fix it. But he sat on the floor outside instead, head in his hands, knees against his chest, silent, ashamed, lost. Have you, or someone you love, faced loss like this? Sometimes sharing your pain becomes someone else's lifeline. Drop a comment below. You never know who you'll help. By the time Maribel found out she was pregnant again, she didn't tell Kellen right away. Not out of secrecy, but out of fear. Fear of what it would mean if hope rose again, and then disappeared. Fear that his eyes would light up like they used to, only to dim too soon. She told him 3 weeks later, sitting across from him at breakfast. There was no announcement, no trembling hands. Just, "It's happening again." He didn't ask what she meant. He knew. She wasn't glowing. She wasn't excited. Her hands didn't rest over her stomach. She looked like someone expecting the ground to open up at any moment. They were careful this time. She stopped working altogether. He rearranged meetings, built buffers into his schedule, kept his phone on loud even during board calls. Every appointment was guarded by caution. Every meal was watched. Every step taken with care. Still, by week 9, the symptoms faded. Maribel didn't cry this time. She just closed the bathroom door behind her, locked it, and didn't come out for nearly an hour. When she did, her face was dry. Her eyes were blank. Kellen reached for her. She stepped around him gently, walked to the bedroom, and lay down fully clothed on top of the covers. He didn't follow, not because he didn't care, but because he no longer knew what comfort meant. In the days that followed, Maribel stopped asking him where he was going. He stopped telling her when he'd be home, not out of anger, not from distance, from weariness. She moved slower now, like even gravity was heavier. She took longer in the shower. She stood by the sink for minutes after brushing her teeth, staring at nothing. She folded baby clothes that had never been used, then placed them in a box without a label. Kellen spent more hours at the office, longer nights, louder calls, bigger ambitions. He told himself he was building a future where none of this pain would follow them. But the truth was, he was running. Because if he stayed still, he'd have to face the fact that no amount of success could protect the woman he loved from this kind of suffering. By month's end, neither of them said the word. Not out loud, not in writing. It became something sacred, too painful to name, too present to ignore. Maribel began watering the plants more often, even the ones that didn't need it. She lined them up on the windowsill, trimmed dead leaves, rotated their positions for the sun. Kellen noticed how she lingered there, fingers brushing soil, eyes unfocused. Some mornings, he'd find her sitting on the floor of the guest room, staring at a bare wall where a crib was once supposed to go. She never said a word about it, neither did he. They moved around each other like people who didn't want to disturb the air. Quiet footsteps, soft doors, conversations that skimmed the surface. She stopped playing music in the kitchen. He stopped offering coffee in the morning. Work consumed him. It was easier that way. Rise Tech had just secured a mid-sized government contract, clean grid expansion for rural districts. His name was starting to circulate in rooms he used to only dream of. But even in his proudest moments, there was a part of him that stayed silent. He'd walk into boardrooms with a practiced smile, deliver flawless presentations, shake hands, close deals, and then sit in his car in the parking garage, forehead against the steering wheel, eyes closed, breathing, just breathing. He bought Maribel a necklace, small, elegant, 3 stones. She thanked him, kissed his cheek, but she didn't wear it, not once. At night, they still slept side by side, but dreams were no longer shared. She flinched in her sleep now, quiet tremors in her legs, a soft gasp she'd never remember by morning. He lay awake more often than not, staring at the ceiling, thinking of everything they'd once whispered in the dark, all the names they had chosen, all the futures they'd mapped out like blueprints. They were still in love, but love was tired, and no one talks about what happens when love gets tired. The day he missed their anniversary, he didn't realize it until past midnight. He came home to find a note on the fridge. No anger, no sadness, just dinner's in the oven. You worked late again. Happy anniversary. He stood there, jacket still on, staring at the handwriting that had once filled notebooks with love letters. Now it left him single sentences that said everything. He reheated the food, ate in silence. She didn't come out of the bedroom. And he didn't knock. They became experts in pretending. Kellen's name began circulating in tech circles as a rising innovator, young, charismatic, well-spoken. The media liked his story, the hometown boy who built something sustainable, scalable, and socially responsible. His face appeared in business magazines. His quotes were used in keynote slides across the industry. People referred to him with words like pioneer and visionary. He didn't correct them. Maribel stood beside him at press events, product launches, and charity dinners. Her dresses were tasteful, her expressions soft, her posture flawless. They looked like success, like harmony, like the dream every ambitious couple aspired to. Behind the camera flashes, they barely spoke. In public, they smiled the way people do when they've memorized what's expected. They held hands when the photographers asked, kissed cheeks during award ceremonies, delivered rehearsed remarks with perfect timing. "She's my rock," Kellen once said during a panel discussion. He meant it. She was also the reason he couldn't breathe some nights. At a rooftop gala hosted by a clean energy think tank, Maribel stood by the railing, looking out at the skyline, while Kellen mingled with venture capitalists. Every few minutes, someone would call him back for another handshake, another introduction, another compliment disguised as a business pitch. When he returned to her side, he touched her elbow gently. "You okay?" She smiled faintly. Of course, that was the script. Later that night, back at their apartment, she took off her earrings without a word and left them on the bathroom counter. He watched her brush her hair in the mirror. Her eyes didn't meet his. "You didn't eat much," he said quietly. "Wasn't hungry." He wanted to press further, but he didn't, because he already knew the answer. The more visible Kellen became, the harder it was to acknowledge what was missing. He received an award from the National Innovation Board, a crystal monument with his name etched into the base. As he walked off stage, applause trailing behind him, he scanned the crowd for her. She was there, smiling, always smiling, but the moment their eyes met, he knew. She was proud of him, but she was no longer connected to him. At home, their shared space became a showroom, tidy, organized, untouched. The couch cushions stayed perfectly fluffed. The wine glasses never left the cabinet. The music that once played during late-night dinners was replaced by silence and news updates humming from a kitchen smart speaker. They lived like guests in a home they had designed together but no longer inhabited. She spent more time in the garden, less time answering texts. She took walks without telling him, disappearing for hours, returning with that same faraway look. He filled the silence with work, more meetings, more late nights, More keynote appearances, where he talked about building futures while quietly losing his present. There were photos of them on the Rise Tech homepage, laughing at charity events, standing side by side in front of solar prototypes, captured mid-conversation as if caught in some perfect, unscripted moment. Maribel looked elegant in every shot. Kellen looked accomplished. What the world couldn't see was how rehearsed it all had become. They had developed an almost mechanical sense of timing, when to lean in for a whisper, when to smile at the same time, when to step aside for the other to speak. It was graceful, polished, and entirely hollow. When interviews asked about their relationship, Kellen spoke about partnership. She believed in this vision before anyone else did, he'd say. He wasn't lying, but he left out the part where they hadn't shared a real conversation in weeks. He stopped inviting her to product launches. She stopped asking where he was going. One evening he came home early, earlier than expected. No meetings, no calls, just an urge he couldn't name. He found her in the kitchen, standing still. Her hands were wet, hovering over a pile of unwashed dishes. She wasn't moving, just standing. "Hey," he said, setting his keys on the counter. She looked over her shoulder and nodded once. No smile, no surprise. Just acknowledgement. He moved toward her slowly, like approaching someone on a ledge. "I was thinking," he began, "maybe we could take a few days. Just us. No tech, no phone. Maybe that little place we used to talk about in the hill country?" She didn't answer right away. Then, softly, "You'd check your phone within the hour." He swallowed, unsure what to say. "I miss you," he finally said. She nodded again. "I know." The next morning, he found her reading on the back porch with a cup of tea in her lap. The sunlight hit her hair, and for a split second she looked like the girl who once raced him through gravel streets on a rusted bike. But it passed quickly. He stood in the doorway, watching her for a moment longer than she noticed. And he wondered, how long had it been since he made her laugh? Not a smile, not polite amusement, but real laughter. The kind that shook her shoulders and made her cover her mouth. He couldn't remember. He went to work that day and signed a major partnership deal with an international firm. The legal team clapped. His CEO founder slapped his back. Cameras flashed. But when the CEO of the partner company raised his glass and toasted to legacy, Kellen felt something twist in his chest. Legacy. What was he building if the one person he wanted to share it with was slipping further away each day? That night, Maribel didn't wait up. She had left a single lamp on in the hallway and a glass of water on his side of the bed. No note, no coldness, just quiet care. But even kindness, when paired with distance, can feel like grief. The flight from Seattle landed just after 9 p.m. Kellen didn't tell anyone, not his assistant, not his driver, not even his own calendar. He hadn't planned it. Somewhere between the hotel lobby and the car to the airport, he just veered. The keynote could wait. For once, the world could wait. It was November, and the air had that early winter bite, not sharp, just cold enough to remind you what season you were in. The kind of cold that used to make Maribel tuck her hands into his coat pockets while they walked home from the library. He parked a few houses down and walked the rest of the way in silence, velvet box heavy in his coat pocket. 12 years. 12 years of building, of losing, of holding things together with careful, practiced hands. And now here he was, outside the same home that had once been filled with laughter and name lists and echoing plans for forever. He wasn't sure what he expected. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. The lights were on in the living room, but the house felt still. He stepped inside without making a sound. His footsteps were soft against the floor, careful, unsure, like someone entering sacred ground. He found her on the balcony. She was wrapped in a shawl, cream-colored, the one she only wore when she couldn't sleep. Her frame looked smaller than he remembered, or maybe he just hadn't been looking. She didn't turn right away, but when she did, it wasn't surprise that crossed her face. It was something else, recognition, weariness, and something that looked a lot like relief. "You're home," she said quietly. He gave a breath of a smile, surprise. She turned back to the skyline. He stepped beside her, close but not touching. "I was going to come back tomorrow," he said, "but I changed my mind." She nodded. "Anniversary's tomorrow." "I didn't forget." "I know." They stood there for a long time, saying nothing. It wasn't tense, just heavy. The kind of quiet you hold your breath inside. "I was going to call you," she said, finally. He looked over, heart rising slowly into his throat. She met his eyes. "But I didn't know how." There was something in her voice, raw, unguarded. He stepped closer. "What is it?" She hesitated, and then stepped forward, just enough to take his hand. "I'm pregnant." He blinked, once, twice. The words didn't move through his brain like a sentence. They hit him in the chest like impact. He didn't speak. His hand gripped hers tighter. She looked down. "I found out last week. I wanted to wait until I was sure." Still no words. She reached up to touch his face, but he was already moving. Down to his knees. Head bowed. Hands shaking. Not from fear, but from something deeper. Something like release. He pressed his forehead gently against her stomach. Closed his eyes. Let his breath slow. A sound left him. A short, cracked breath that wasn't quite a sob, but close. If this story touched something in you, drop a heart in the comments. Let's celebrate second chances together. They didn't move for a long time. Kellen still knelt, forehead resting against her body, arms wrapped loosely around. Her hips like someone who had found solid ground after years of drifting. Maribel's hands trembled as they ran through his hair, unsure whether to comfort or anchor. When he finally stood, his face was streaked with tears. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "For what?" He swallowed. "For everything. For disappearing. For making you carry all of it alone." She didn't speak right away. "Then, you didn't leave. You were here. But I lost you anyway." That hurt, because it was true. They walked inside together, wordless. She set the kettle on the stove. He stood in the doorway, watching her move, familiar but somehow new. "I wanted to tell you 100 different times," she said, not turning around. "But I didn't know how it would land. I didn't want it to feel like pressure, or punishment, or hope." He stepped closer. "It doesn't. It feels like air." She finally turned. Her eyes were damp, but steady. "I don't know how to do this again, Kel." He nodded slowly. "Neither do I." They sat on the floor, tea between them, knees touching. "I was angry," she said. "Not just at life, at you, at me, at everything." He looked down. "I kept thinking, maybe if I smiled more, cried less, supported harder, maybe then it would have been different. You didn't do anything wrong. Neither did you. And still, it happened anyway." Kellen leaned his head against the wall, eyes closing for a moment. "I'd be in meetings, pitching the future of energy to billionaires, and all I could think about was how your chair was empty at home." She blinked. "I thought you forgot. I tried to convince myself work was helping, but it wasn't. It was hiding." A silence settled, not uncomfortable this time, just open. "I want this," he said finally. She looked at him. "I'm terrified," she replied. "So am I. But I want it too." They smiled. Soft. Fragile. Like it might break if they pushed too hard. But it didn't. Kellen stood and offered her his hand. Maribel looked at it for a second, as if unsure. Then she placed hers in his. He led her to the bedroom, not rushed, not assuming. Just walking slowly, the way you carry something delicate. The room hadn't changed much in years. Same furniture, same arrangement. But something about it felt different now. Like it could be theirs again. She sat on the edge of the bed. He knelt in front of her again, just like he had earlier on the balcony. But this time he rested his forehead against her knees. "I've missed you," he whispered. Her fingers slid into his hair. "I didn't think we'd find our way back." "We haven't," he said gently. "But we're standing at the start of it." They didn't rush anything that night. There was no performance, no effort to impress. Just the slow relearning of how to be near one another. They lay in bed, limbs woven, foreheads touching, breathing the same quiet rhythm. She rested his hand on her stomach. He held it there like it was the most sacred place on earth. They talked until past midnight. Not about the company, not about logistics or baby names. They talked about fear, about the things they never said out loud, about how grief had made them strangers, but love had refused to let go completely. Maribel laughed, really laughed, when Kellen admitted he once tried to learn how to knit because he thought it would help him relax. "Show me," she said, still smiling. "I never made it past a tangled ball of yarn." Her laughter turned to tears, but this time they weren't heavy. They were clean. He kissed her forehead. She pulled him closer. Later, they lay in the dark. "Do you think we'll be okay?" she asked softly. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but I know I'll show up every day trying." She nodded. "That's enough." Outside, the wind moved through the trees like a whisper. Inside, two people finally stopped pretending they were fine. And in the stillness, something inside both of them began to breathe again. They didn't rush into joy. It came back in fragments, like the slow return of color after a long winter. They started taking walks again. Not long ones, just around the block, then a little farther. Kellen noticed things he hadn't in years, how Maribel always reached for fallen leaves, with unusual patterns, how she tilted her face toward the sun even when it was faint. They didn't hold hands at first, but they walked close enough to hear each other breathe. One afternoon, Maribel stopped in front of a small bookstore they used to visit during college. It had changed owners, but the chime above the door still sounded the same. Inside, they wandered separate aisles, like strangers. She found him 20 minutes later, sitting cross-legged on the floor with a parenting book open in his lap. "I have no idea what I'm doing," he said. She smiled gently. "We'll figure it out." That sentence, simple as it was, felt like a contract. At home, the nursery became their quiet project. They painted the walls in soft, earthy green. No theme, no pressure, just calm. They unpacked old boxes they had once hidden away. Stuffed animals, untouched onesies, blankets folded with hope and grief. For the first time, they placed them on shelves instead of in storage. Kellen built a mobile by hand, small wooden animals suspended by twine. He cut himself twice. She kissed each finger, then helped him thread the final piece. They began writing again, not to each other, but together. Maribel started drafting lullabies on the old keyboard tucked in the corner of the guest room. She would hum softly, unsure, pencil tapping against the sheet music. Kellen began jotting down letters to their future child. At first, they were stiff, awkward, but then something shifted. He wrote about fear, about nights he couldn't sleep, about the joy he didn't know how to hold on to. She read one, then cried, not because it hurt, but because it finally felt safe to feel everything. Maribel planted lavender in the yard. "I want her to have memories that smell like something peaceful," she said. Kellen planted daisies next to them, something bright. They laughed when a squirrel dug up the first row. He rebuilt the bed. She set a small stone next to it with the letter E carved into the center. They didn't say the name aloud yet, but it hung between them like a promise. Ricetech was changing fast. More contracts, bigger stakes, international interest. Kellen's face was on a new article every week. From garage to grid, how one CEO is powering the future they called him unstoppable, untouchable. They didn't see the man who now scheduled his meetings after prenatal appointments, who turned down speaking slots to walk hand in hand through local parks, who asked his wife each morning, "Do you feel okay today?" and meant it. The board wasn't pleased. "You're needed in person," one executive said during a quarterly review. "Momentum like this doesn't happen twice," another warned. "You've got a legacy to protect." Kellen listened, politely. He let them finish. Then he leaned forward, adjusted the microphone, and said 4 quiet words. "My family comes first." Silence. The kind of silence that doesn't signal conflict, but clarity. He didn't apologize. He didn't explain. He just closed his notebook, stood, and walked out. That evening, he made dinner from scratch. Not because it was a special occasion, but because every evening felt like one now. Maribel lit a candle, low and flickering. They sat across from each other. No phones, no interruptions, just two people remembering how to share a meal. "I heard back from Dr. Seaton," she said, halfway through dinner. Kellen paused, fork midair. "Everything okay?" She nodded. "More than okay. Strong heartbeat, healthy growth. I recorded it." She slid her phone across the table. He pressed play. There it was, steady, rhythmic, impossibly real. He closed his eyes and let the sound fill him. Later, in bed, he stared at the ceiling. "Do you think she'll ever know?" he asked. "Know what?" "How long we waited. How hard it was to find our way here." Maribel shifted, rested her head on his chest. "She'll feel it, in the way we love her, in the way we don't take a single moment for granted." He kissed the top of her head. "I hope so." In the garden, new growth pushed through soil that had once been left untouched. The lavender bloomed first. Then the daisies. Every morning, before she made tea, Maribel stepped outside barefoot and watered each stem. She didn't rush. She didn't hum. She just moved with calm purpose. Sometimes Kellen watched from the doorway, arms crossed, heart full. He didn't call out to her. He didn't interrupt. He just stood still and memorized the moment. Because these were the parts of life he'd almost missed. And now, he wasn't going anywhere. The joy came quietly this time. Not loud, not bursting. It settled into the corners of their days like soft light through half-open curtains. Maribel didn't speak about names or themes or color palettes. She didn't browse baby stores or post ultrasound photos. Instead, she moved through her days like someone protecting something sacred. Kellen followed her lead. They didn't announce the pregnancy. Not yet. It was theirs first. At every appointment, Kellen held his breath until the doctor confirmed a heartbeat. Then he'd exhale slowly, stealing a glance at Maribel, whose hands always rested protectively over her belly, as if holding it still would keep everything in place. Their OB, Dr. Seaton, had a calm voice and gentle eyes. She knew their history. She didn't rush. She let silence fill the space when needed. At 14 weeks, everything looked stable. At 16, growth was right on track. At 18, Maribel finally smiled during an appointment. A real one. Not out of relief, but presence. That night, Kellen found her in the kitchen, humming again. She was slicing apples with slow rhythm, a small towel draped over her shoulder. He paused in the doorway, watching, hands in his pockets. "You're singing," he said softly. She didn't stop what she was doing. "I didn't realize." He walked up behind her, wrapped his arms around her waist, rested his hands on the curve that was slowly beginning to show. Neither of them spoke after that. They didn't need to. They started writing letters. It began as a suggestion from their therapist, write to the baby, even if you don't know how to begin. Maribel's first letter was one sentence long. "You are more than a heartbeat to me." She left it on the kitchen table. The next morning there was a folded sheet beside it, Kellen's handwriting. "We haven't met yet, but I think about you every time I see light through the window." Soon, it became a ritual. Not every day, but often. They filled a notebook with folded pages and gentle confessions. "We want to give you a world that listens more than it speaks. Your mom has a laugh that can break silence. I hope you inherit that. And some days we're still scared, but that means we're awake." The first kick came on a Wednesday morning. Maribel was curled on the couch, tea in hand, blanket tucked around her knees. The house was quiet, no news playing, no phone buzzing. Kellen was at the table, writing a note to one of Rice Tech's new team leads. The sound of the pen scratching paused when she inhaled sharply. Her hand went to her stomach. She didn't speak. He turned to look. Her eyes were wide, startled, and wet. She set the mug down carefully, then motioned him over. "She moved," she whispered. She couldn't finish the sentence. Her voice broke. He dropped to his knees beside her, placed his palm on the same spot she had touched. A few seconds passed, then a soft push against his hand, gentle but real. His breath caught. "I felt her." Maribel laughed and cried at the same time. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't quiet. It was free. She buried her face in her hands, overwhelmed. He held her, both of them frozen in a moment that felt too big to hold, so they just let it wash over them. They started talking to the baby after that. Not just during quiet evenings or journal entries, but in the middle of doing dishes, folding laundry, brushing teeth. "Your dad can't dance," Maribel would say, smiling as he spun her in the hallway. "Your mom made your crib blanket from scratch," he'd say later, holding up a lopsided square she'd stitched with uneven stars. Each sentence stitched new threads between past hurt and present joy. Still, the fear didn't vanish. There were nights when Maribel woke up gasping, hand on her belly, heart pounding. Kellen would switch on the lamp, rub her back, whisper, "She's okay, you're okay." Sometimes, they'd sit in silence for an hour, waiting for a single reassuring movement. Other times they called Dr. Seaton, apologizing at 2 a.m., voice shaking. The doctor never sounded bothered. "You're not alone," she would say. "Call anytime." They installed a rocking chair in the nursery, soft gray, worn in. It became Maribel's favorite place. She'd sit for hours there, reading aloud from children's books. Some days she didn't finish a page. Other days she read whole chapters. Kellen listened from the doorway more often than not. He didn't interrupt. He just stood there, quiet, grateful. At 30 weeks, they packed a hospital bag. Not because they were ready, but because preparing no longer felt like tempting fate. It felt like trust. One evening, as the sky shifted from gold to deep blue, Kellen handed her a folded note. Inside was a single line. "Whatever happens next, you've already changed me forever." She looked up at him, her expression steady, full. "No matter what?" she asked. He nodded. "No matter what." Outside, the garden swayed softly in the wind. Inside, life moved beneath her skin. And just like that, the waiting became something beautiful. Not because they were certain, but because they had finally made peace with the unknown. The contraction started at 3:41 a.m. Maribel didn't panic. She simply sat up, placed a hand on her stomach, and closed her eyes. Kellen stirred beside her, waking to the sound of her breath. Slow, controlled, deep. He reached over. "Is it time?" She nodded once. They didn't rush. There was no scrambling. The bags were packed. The route had been driven 3 times. The car seat installed with quiet precision. He helped her into her coat. She reached for his hand. Their grip was firm, not fearful, ready. The streets were empty. The world still half asleep. Orange light began stretching along the horizon, just a whisper of dawn. Maribel's head leaned back against the seat, eyes closed, face calm. She breathed in patterns she had practiced for weeks. Kellen didn't speak. His eyes flicked between the road and her profile. Every light turned green. Every minute passed without chaos. For the first time in a long time, the silence between them felt like peace. By the time they reached the hospital, the sky was glowing softly, as if the world had been waiting too. The labor room was quiet. No television, no background noise. Just the beeping of the monitor, the occasional voice of a nurse, and the steady rhythm of Maribel's breathing. Kellen stayed close, one hand on her shoulder, the other gripping hers. He said little, just, "You're doing so well." And later, "I'm here." She didn't need more than that. Hours passed. Then everything shifted. Not suddenly, but with unmistakable purpose. The doctor entered with calm clarity. The nurses moved into quiet motion. Maribel's grip tightened. She looked at Kellen, her voice rough but steady. "You're about to meet her." He felt his heart press against his ribs like it had outgrown its place. And then came the cry, high and sharp and whole. Kellen broke. His hand covered his mouth. His knees buckled slightly. He didn't fall, but he bent forward as if the sound itself had humbled him. The nurse placed the newborn into Maribel's arms. She stared for a long time, then laughed, a soft, breathless sound, as tears streamed down her cheeks. Kellen knelt beside her. They were both crying now. Have you ever experienced a miracle just when you were about to give up? Let us know. Your story could be someone's hope. They spent the next hour in silence. Maribel held her close, skin to skin, while Kellen sat at the edge of the bed, one hand resting lightly on both of them. The nurses came and went, checking vitals, adjusting monitors, whispering when they spoke. But inside that room, time had changed. It no longer moved by the clock. It moved by breath, by heartbeat, by the slow unfurling of something that had been buried for years, peace. When the nurse returned to complete the birth certificate, she asked gently, "Have you decided on a name?" Maribel looked at Kellen. He nodded. "Ilowen," she said. The nurse smiled. "Beautiful." "Meaning?" Maribel answered quietly. "Elm tree. It means strength, grace." The nurse wrote it down without asking anything further. But Kellen saw something shift in Maribel's face when she said it, like naming their daughter wasn't just about identity. It was closure and beginning. They had chosen the name years ago. After the second loss, it had been buried beneath fear. Now, it had come back to life. That night, when the hospital room emptied and the hallway quieted, Maribel turned to him and whispered, "Do you remember our wedding night?" He smiled. "You mean the one with cold pizza and no furniture?" "Yes," she whispered. "We didn't have a plan then either, but we had each other." He reached across the bed, fingers brushing hers. "We still do." They stayed like that for a long time, her on one side of the bassinet, him on the other, watching their daughter sleep. Every so often, Maribel would glance at Kellen, as if checking to see if he was still there. He always was. This time, he wasn't going anywhere. Around 3 a.m., Elowen stirred. Not a cry, just a rustle, a stretch, a sound so small it almost didn't register. Kellen stood and gently picked her up, cradling her close. Her head fit perfectly against his chest. He sat back down beside Maribel, who watched in silence, eyes wide and soft. "She's here," he whispered. Maribel nodded. "She's real." They leaned into each other, their daughter between them, held in the warmth of two people who had once lost everything, but stayed. In the dim hospital light, Kellen closed his eyes. He thought of every missed heartbeat, every appointment filled with silence, every moment they had doubted they could ever feel this again. And then, he thought of this one, where the world was still, the room was warm, and the sound of breathing, hers, Maribel's, his, was all that filled the air. They had built an empire once, but this was legacy. Spring returned like a familiar song. The lavender came first, waking beneath cool soil, then the daisies, then the vines they never planted, curling along the back fence like they had always belonged. Maribel tended the garden with quiet reverence. Each bloom carried a name, not spoken aloud, not shared with others, but known, remembered. The first corner held violet hyacinths, 3 of them, planted in silence. On a Sunday morning, just a few weeks after Elowen was born. She didn't explain why. She didn't need to. Kellen knew. He watched her from the kitchen window, holding their daughter, arms swaying gently as she stirred in her sleep. They called it the memory garden, not because it was about sorrow, but because it was about what remained: love, presence, the invisible weight of those who shaped them, even in absence. Every Saturday became theirs. Kellen cooked breakfast. Maribel read from a stack of hand-me-down children's books. Sometimes Elowen listened. Sometimes she fell asleep mid-story, one hand curled around Maribel's finger. They recorded episodes of something they jokingly called the family podcast, just the 2 of them, whispering into a cheap microphone while Elowen slept. Topics included, and things we wish we knew before parenthood, why we still don't understand baby socks and how one laugh at 2 a.m. changed our week. It wasn't for an audience. It was for them. A time capsule, a rhythm, a reminder that the small things were the big things. One evening, after Elowen had fallen asleep, Kellen sat at his desk by the window, flipping through pages of the journal they had written during Maribel's pregnancy. Some entries were messy, scribbled in half-light and exhaustion. Others were poetic, careful, vulnerable. At the back of the journal, he tucked in one final page, one he had written that afternoon in the garden. He read it aloud, softly, his voice low and steady. Maribel sat nearby, watching him, not interrupting, just listening. "Dear Elowen, you won't remember the night you were born. You won't remember the quiet, or the first cry, or the way your mother looked at you like you were made of something softer than air. But I will. You won't remember how scared we were, how long we waited, how many times we almost gave up. But I do, and I remember the moment it all turned. It wasn't when we heard your heartbeat. It wasn't even when we held you. It was when we chose to let the past stay behind us, and let love come back through the door. You've already taught me more than I ever learned in boardrooms or books. You've taught me that strength is soft, that presence is louder than praise, that healing isn't always grand. It's in the quiet routines, the morning walks, the bedtime stories, the soil beneath your mom's fingernails. When you're older, you'll hear parts of this story, maybe not all at once, maybe not from me, but I hope you'll always know that before you arrived, we had stopped believing in miracles. And then you showed up, without needing to be perfect or planned or explained. Just real, and that was enough. Love, Dad." Maribel didn't speak when he finished. She reached over, closed the journal, and set her hand on top of his. Outside, the garden swayed in the night air. Inside, the house was full, not of noise, not of trophies, but of peace. Kellen once believed that life's turning points would come in the form of grand speeches or monumental victories, but now, standing barefoot on the porch of his home, watching Elowen chase butterflies across the lawn, he knew better. Change wasn't always loud. Sometimes it came in whispers. Sometimes it looked like forgiveness. In their earliest years, love had felt easy, natural, like sunlight through a window, something you didn't have to think about to feel. But time had taught them otherwise. Love, he realized, was not a constant. It was a practice, a discipline. It needed rhythm and return, not perfection. The deepest kind of connection didn't survive on autopilot. It thrived on attention. They had almost lost that truth. Almost. But almost wasn't the end. They had learned to speak again, not with scripted romance, but through the ordinary. Dishes washed side by side. Doors held open. Check-ins that meant, I see you. I choose you still. Love was not just emotion. It was maintenance. And every day was an invitation to tend to it. The world had offered them polite sympathy during their losses. Flowers, cards, quiet nods of understanding. But few had spoken about what came after. The silence, the hollow days, the resentment that sometimes followed sorrow, not at each other, but at the randomness of fate. Maribel had once said, I feel like we grieve in different languages. And Kellen had replied, maybe we need to build a new one. Together, that's what they did. They stopped treating grief like a private burden. Instead, they named it aloud, held space for each other's pain, gave it a seat at the table, not to dwell, but to soften its weight. In doing so, they didn't erase grief. They translated it into empathy, tenderness, and closeness. Rise Tech had once been Kellen's oxygen, its growth, its influence. It filled his calendar, his inbox, his identity. But the night Maribel told him she was expecting, something shifted. The applause from investors, the glowing headlines, the polished accolades, they all felt suddenly quiet. He had missed too many dinners, too many good nights, too many chances to just be there. Stepping back hadn't been a resignation, it had been a return. He hadn't built Rise Tech alone, but for too long, he had carried it like he did. In choosing his family, he didn't abandon his ambition, he redefined it. Now success was measured differently, in laughter echoing down the hall, in Saturdays without meetings, in the warm weight of his daughter asleep on his chest. He still cared about impact, but now he understood, legacy isn't what you build, it's who you build it with. There were days the past still whispered, unexpected moments, Eloin's laugh sounding eerily familiar, or a shadow crossing Maribel's expression when a lullaby played. Healing didn't follow a straight road. It twisted, paused, repeated itself. Sometimes it hurt more after things got better, because joy made them realize what they had once feared they'd never feel again. But that was okay. They stopped expecting perfection from themselves or each other. Some wounds faded. Others became part of the architecture of their love, scars not to be hidden, but honored. The goal wasn't to forget. It was to keep walking, together. There was a time when Kellen believed intimacy was built on grand gestures. Now, it was different. It lived in the quiet brush of hands passing a cup of tea, in unspoken glances that said, I've got you, in dancing barefoot in the living room while Eloin clapped along. They had learned that real closeness was made of the invisible, the daily choice to remain known. Vulnerability wasn't weakness. It was the doorway to deeper love. And every time they crossed it, they found each other again. If you've been carrying pain in silence, if you've ever questioned whether it's too late to begin again, if you've forgotten how to reach for someone you once held close, let this story remind you it is not over. You're allowed to love again, to heal, to rebuild what matters. You are allowed to bloom where it once felt barren. And if this story reminded you to hold your loved ones a little closer, like, share, and subscribe to the Mr. Ross Story Trail. Let's keep walking this path together, one story at a time, because even the quietest chapters can lead to the most beautiful endings.